Kurt, thank you so much for joining me today on Range of Change.
Thanks.
I'm very excited to talk to you. Kurt, you are a professional musician. You are an elite professional musician. You have had roles that are just so niche that almost nobody in the whole world has had them, which is incredible. Interested to hear about that, transitioning to your own work and artistry and what you've been able to do in this phase of your career. But the first question that I always ask some variation of to my guests is, let's fast forward. It's late August. You walk in the door, and unbeknownst to you, your wife has thrown a surprise party. So people are yelling surprise. You're completely caught off guard. Do you love this? Do you hate this?
Oh, I would love this because it's never happened. Now, I've thrown surprise parties for Sarah. I know she's listening in the next room.
Hint. Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Yeah, I love to try to gauge generally how people feel about change, surprise. And so I always ask some version of that. Fun. Glad to hear that you are somebody who is open to surprises and pivots and all of those unexpected changes.
Well, it's also the nature of my profession is that things can go wrong. And you have to be flexible. And you have to remember that it's not always sabotage or malicious. It's just people can forget lines. They can forget music. Instruments can have failures. So you're constantly fielding these random occurrences.
That's so amazing. Like I don't think about that as a musician. And, you know, I should point out that you were in the pit of Phantom for its entire run. You have been an elite professional musician your entire career. Not something most of us can necessarily relate to. And I don't think of it as something where you're constantly listening on edge, ready to pivot. But I guess as you describe it, it makes perfect sense that it's a high stakes situation. People have spent a lot of money. They've waited their whole life to be in that moment, and failures can happen.
Well, one of the great things about Phantom, and just to, for the record, I joined the orchestra 10 years into the run. So I was not an original member, but I was still there for 25 years.
Sure.
And over that period of 25 years, I've seen just about every possible catastrophe. But I think one of the great things about the Phantom of the Opera as a musical was that it was more like a classical opera than a rock and roll show or typical Broadway show, in that there's a lot of flexibility. So you always had to stay on your toes because people would just do things a little bit differently. And not that it was intentional, it was organic. And I think that was part of the success of this production, was that the music allowed for that flexibility, and it gave the music a certain spontaneous quality. And for that reason, I think it had it was more like a baseball phenomenon that, you know, why do people keep going to see baseball games? Because no two are really the same. And they can be very exciting. And the show can also be very exciting, be really on the edge. And of course, I would tap into that energy. And that's what kept it, for me, interesting and fresh, even though I've probably played several thousand performances.
Wow, yeah. So that improvisational element, do you think that's something you honed during these several thousand performances, or do you think you were drawn to something like this because you have that innate interest?
Well, I think that was part of my original composition as a person. I grew up in a small town in northwest Pennsylvania, so there weren't a lot of opportunities for a young musician to study or develop. I had a pretty good teacher, and he taught at Penn State University, so I was able to kind of take advantage of some of those opportunities. But I think the one thing that really got me hooked into this violin playing thing because I'm a guy, and back in the 70s that was like really tough, especially in small towns. There really weren't other people playing. My family had moved there from Buffalo, and so my dad transferred his job. So when I was starting 6th grade, I'd already started playing, and I wanted to keep going. And it was sort of like my connection with the old world, that suburban, urban world that I had grown up in, and then moving into a very rural area. I wanted to keep that connection. And so I kept playing. It was, more for my own amusement. And my grandmother, there was this family myth that she had a Stradivarius violin, and she'd give it to any of the grandchildren that would learn to play it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an inspiration for a while. And then, of course, turned out it wasn't, but it was too late. I was already well into my career as a violinist. But when I was in high school, a buddy of mine was a guitarist. And we wound up creating our own arrangements of all these folk songs. And we would play the 8:15 folk mass in the local Catholic church. And that developed my skills of using music as a tool, building blocks, that I was doing things just naturally and by ear that I would then learn what I was doing in music school. But I had this sort of self-taught ability, which was kind of unusual for violinists back in those days. That was you were either a classically trained violinist and you just read notes, or you were a self-taught violinist and played bluegrass. So there were very few. All my heroes were the jazz violinists, which was a small number of them. And when I went to music school, I wanted to study jazz, but there was no jazz violin programs at that time.
Oh.
Now there's a lot of them because people like myself has sort of forced that to happen. So in that sense, I have a unique connection with the education process that just naturally developed this language and a methodology to support my personal ambitions.
That's amazing. And it's a really interesting point you bring up because you are an artist. And so you, sort of your day job, even though it was your night job most days, is to go and play, this beloved musical. But you also have had your own projects and your own interests. And so I imagine that Phantom closing is a bit of a mixed blessing in terms of, that's probably one of the best steady gigs a professional musician can have. But now you've all this time to pursue your own interests.
So when I went to music school, I learned that there was this great tradition of violinist composers. And all the great classical composers from yesteryear were violinists or had studied violinists. Most of them were performing pianists, and they were Beethoven, Mozart, they were the rock stars of their generation. But they all improvised, and they would improvise these cadenzas that were part of the concertos. And it just fascinated me. So, of course, I immediately started writing my own cadenzas to classical concertos, which met with a lot of resistance from my professors because they had never done that. That they came up in the sort of the 19th century conservatory model where creativity was kind of discouraged almost.
Wow.
That you learn this music by the taste and standards of the intelligentsia, and there really wasn't a lot of room for that sort of thing where violinists were expected to develop their personal sound and style, but it did not include composition or improvisation. Now, of course, there are the exceptions. Fritz Kreisler used to make up composers because his name would appear so often on a program, but I definitely tapped into that that tradition. And then it was just a short leap till I started writing music and writing my own music. And then once I started composing, then you start learning about the different techniques and styles of composers. And I went down the academic rabbit hole where I became a sort of obnoxious 12-tone composer, where if the audience liked what you were doing, then you were clearly doing something wrong.
Gotcha.
So,
I mean, you were clearly ahead of your time. Like, it sounds like you had to almost develop your own academic program, so to speak, because it didn't exist for you. Your professors were resistant. And I think it's interesting that you ended up at a point where you almost wanted to be unpopular to ensure that you were doing it right.
well, that was sort of one of my major influences was a Pulitzer Prize winning, MacArthur Award winning composer, Charles Warren, who's no longer with us. But one of the phrases that he coined that he became very well known for was the musical necrophiliacs, and that how classical music, the world of serious music has now been dominated by these dead Germans. And any time that there was a living composer on the program, it was time for people to sort of tune out. And I remember my grandfather, who was a long-term subscriber to the Harrisburg Symphony, would always complain about the world premieres because they were always horrible. And the problem was that this music had become so sophisticated that it lost its audience. Compared to Andrew Lloyd Webber, who his music has a level of sophistication, but I think it's really subtle. And his music is tapping into more popular expressions of popular language. And I have these conversations all the time with my friends who are musical snobs, and I say, look, it's really hard to write a pop song that does well. I mean, look, anybody can write anything that's just dribble, but
Sure.
but to write a song that gets on the top 40, that takes a profound skill and understanding of the tools and the language. So this is all going on in the background because I'm playing a show that is frozen, that every performance, even though there's a tremendous amount of subtle variation from night to night, it's still the same music.
Right.
And that can be very mind-numbing. And so I was fortunate that I could sort of disconnect myself. That even though I was going through this physical similarity from night to night, in my imagination I could continue to dream. And it sort of evolved into this obsession with automata, self-playing instruments, because I love that stuff.
Yeah.
And my wife's brother, Jim Sedgwick, was an electrical engineer, and he introduced me to a programmable motor called a servo. And the servo goes back and forth like a windshield wiper, and you attach a bow to it, and the next thing you know, you've got a bow going back and forth, and by changing the position of the servo motor, you can sort of create rhythms.
Yeah.
And then by using solenoids, you could depress the string like frets, and voila, you've got a robot violin. And it just would freak out my friends, but I just, and I, in all modesty, my robot violin that costs about $300 to build sounds every bit as good as that Yamaha thing that cost over $1 million to make.
Oh my.
And so from there, I wanted to mechanize any instrument I could, and I created this robotic orchestra called the PAM Band, which stands for Partially Artificial Musicians.
So I just have to ask real quick,
yeah.
when did you first put this together?
When did I start experimenting with the motors?
Yeah.
Well, that was about maybe 25 years ago.
Wow. All right. Once again, ahead of your time.
And just all in my basement for my own amusement. I was playing the show at night, making more money than I know what to do with, and in the day playing with my son. He was little, and playing with these motors, and it was a great life. And then I started doing some shows and doing exhibits, and then I was introduced to this young boy up in Connecticut who was a quadriplegic. He had severe learning disability, but had a beautiful face, and he wanted to play the drums in the worst way. And so a producer from Connecticut TV introduced me to the family, and he said, "Can you do something for this guy?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." So I started working with some different interfaces, and I met a brilliant mechanical engineer, IBM retired programmer named Richard Reinecker, who just being in the same room with him has increased my IQ by 25%. And I became sort of the idea guy, and he became the solution person. And so I would say, Richard, I have this idea. I want this to happen. And he would say, "Well, why do you want to do that?" And I'd say, "Well, it doesn't matter. I just want to do it." And so he would sort of figure out what devices would work. And we came up with a whole array of these interfaces that would allow people with disabilities to play musical instruments without being limited by their physical issues. So,
wow.
So the first one was a optical sensor that it works like an alarm. Like when you trip an alarm in a house, what you do is you block a light, infrared light, and that turns on an alarm. Well, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is we want to make an actuator strike a drum. So we attach a pen light to his baseball cap, and by moving his head, he could create the sound of the drum. And boy, was that exciting.
Yeah.
And by learning how to control that motion, opened a whole world to him. That this technology could become the basis of various interfaces that you can do things with computers, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, you made his dream come true. You made a quadriplegic boy got to become a drummer, something that probably he dreamed but didn't believe, and that's amazing.
So having that success allowed me. So in 2010, I was on tour with a chamber orchestra in Europe, and we were doing a festival in Novi Sad, Serbia, when a volcano in Iceland erupted.
Yes, I remember that.
And we were stranded in Serbia, in this artsy town in the middle of Eastern Europe. And I always knew that the Eastern Europeans were totally into this wacky electrical, acoustical, avant-garde experimental music stuff. And so I just started networking. And I was trying to get gigs for the PAM Band. But it turned out that there was an opportunity to get funding to do more of these optical sensor instruments. And a year later, I had built this enormous array of percussion instruments and started a program at a special school, the Milan Petrovich School, and it's still in operation, 14 years later, even though Serbia has gone through 3 or 4 different government changes, and I'm currently not advised to travel there.
Yeah.
But I went many times, and that was another great thing about having a show like Phantom, is that there were probably 150 people hanging around every night waiting for the phone to ring to come in and play for me. So it was never a problem getting a substitute to cover the show. I think the problem was that they would have liked for me to be there more.
Yeah.
But you get to a point where it's like this show's, it's just sort of, it's like a cloud that just won't leave, and so I think in the back of my mind I knew that at some point the show is going to run for a long time, but I probably was not going to get hired for another show because I'd been hanging around Broadway for so long. I think my reputation was just sullied by the fact that I was kind of quasi royalty, and it's just tough because there's it's just the business
Sure.
has its issues, but I was able to take advantage of this opportunity to create some project that was humanitarian in nature and gave back, and after all the tremendous amount of success we had in Serbia, I was able then to I had a residency at Mercy College in Yorktown Heights, and then that led to an opportunity at at NYU at the something.
At NYU.
Yeah. Nordoff Robbins Institute. And they were sort of the original people that had developed a methodology. One of the main problems in the world of physical therapy is this issue of motivation. Because if people are motivated, they can do amazing things. But the problem with physical therapy is that oftentimes if you drop off the curve, insurance stops paying and people can't pay for it, and the whole thing just disintegrates. So one of the great things about this music-based quasi-therapy project was that the motivation's built in. Who doesn't love playing in a drum circle?
Yeah.
And if the act of drumming is also improving a physical issue or developing a physical inability, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
And I think intuitively I realized that would be the net result. But I don't have a background in therapy. I don't have a background in music therapy. I don't have, I'm sort of like a Renaissance guy. I get these ideas, and it just, nothing will stop me from pursuing it. That also has its downside because I get painted into a lot of corners.
Sure. But I mean, I love the takeaway that you had an opportunity, and even though it was inconvenient for the job, like you saw the opportunity, you knew it was your moment. It harkened back to your interest in education and helping people, and so you went for it.
Yeah. And so now that the show's closed and I have nothing but time, I'm getting back into this and going back and cleaning up a lot of stuff, because I just was always about moving forward, and so there's a lot of there are a lot of loose ends, a lot of untied things,
Yeah.
and and uh, and so now I'm ready to like really launch this wholeheartedly. You know, it's I've always sort of kept my toe in it, and had a lot of success, just but without going in wholeheartedly.
Yeah. It's amazing. So we're going to have links to the Pan Band and images, and I'm very excited that you're now at the point in your life where you can give it your all. I think so many of us have that experience of, well, I've got the kids, I've got the job, I've got this, but there's that magical moment when the stars align and you're ready to go for it. And I'm so excited to see it and help and cheer on, and can't wait.
Yeah. Um, at this point, uh, there'll be some there'll be a lot of work. I'll have to set up a 501c3. I'll have to start identifying potential clients. So it will be a real business venture.
Oh, sure.
Um, I would love to find people that that want to help with the project. So allow me to just remain in my play mode where I can continue to develop and experiment and constantly developing new instruments, new interfaces, because the world of adaptive technologies is really a one-off.
Yeah.
See, the violin was perfected in the 17th century, and it hasn't changed. And so the violinist has to adapt to the instrument.
Mm.
So violinists come in all shapes and sizes, but they have to make their bodies fit that instrument. What I'm involved with now is sort of the opposite,
Yeah.
that you have people with unique physical configurations and that you adapt the instrument to them. So there's no one size fits all. And everybody has all kinds of individual permutations.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really interesting almost reversal of the first part of your life,
Yeah.
learning to be an expert. Now you're learning how to make the instrument the expert of the individual. It's wild. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all of this. I think it's amazing. And I mean, what a career, what a life, what a brain you've got to have been able to excel at so many things, and you're forging new territory.
It's all been in the pursuit of being amused.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.